Tell me when. Hi, I'm Luisa Smith. I'm the buying director for Book Passage, and I want to thank you for joining us today. We know you have many events to choose from, both online and in stores these days, and we truly appreciate you spending your time with us. Book Passage is committed to providing excellent author events and book recommendations, and today we are thrilled to continue that tradition by celebrating one of the great writers, Diane Johnson. We'll be posting link to Diane's new book, Lorna Mott Comes Home, in the chat. And if you have any questions for Diane about her new book, her older works, or her writing process, please go ahead and add them to the chat. Diane Johnson is best-selling author of 18 books and has been a finalist for the National Book Award and Pulitzer Prize multiple times. Some of her most famous works include Le Divorce, Persian Nights, and Lulu in Marrakesh. Currently, Diane splits her time between Paris and San Francisco. In her latest book, Lorna Mott Comes Home, it's the story of a woman of a certain age who has been married for 20 years to a Frenchman when she finally has had enough of his distinctly French attitude towards monogamy. Homesick for America and looking to find herself again, she separates from him and heads back to San Francisco. But coming home is not exactly how she imagines it, and her now grown children from her first marriage have complicated lives of their own. A brilliant novel of family, life, and love in the midst of chaos. And with that, I'd love to welcome Diane to the conversation, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Luisa. It's delightful.
Oh, we're so excited to have you home, and I understand you are back in San Francisco.
I am actually back home in San Francisco, so it seems very appropriate to.
Yes, very appropriate. So welcome home.
Art, yeah.
Yes. And with that, do you think I could ask you to just begin our conversation with just the opening to your new books, to give people a taste of what to expect?
Yes. Sometimes the metaphorical significance of a random event startles with its application to your life. Lorna Mott was thinking this when she asked Monsieur Just to stop his taxi so she could walk a little way along the road above the graveyard of Pont-les-Puits. The whole village was talking this morning about how in the darkness during last night's heavy rains, the cemetery had dislodged itself and with the stealth of a nocturnal predator slid 500 meters downhill, where the astonished citizens this morning had discovered a huge sticky hillock of treacherous clay, burst coffins, broken bones, corpses, and bones, broken stones, corpses, and bones. Only the oldest gravestones remained standing with unseeing dignity above the sacrilegious chaos. It was Lorna's last day in Pont-les-Puits, and she would leave with this ominous sight in mind as a kind of cautionary reminder of consequences unforeseen. Her departure, escape as she was thinking of it now, was both impulsive and planned. Once she was safely on the train to Lyon, she could admit that subconsciously she had been planning a while for a future in California without her husband, Armand Lou. They needed some time apart, and the things she'd been doing could be construed as unconscious strategies to accomplish this. For instance, recently publishing her collected art lectures and accepting a lecture appearance in Bakersfield, California, where she was headed now. Bakersfield was hardly at the level of places she'd lectured before her marriage, but going there was a toe in the water of her return to professional life. She'd been thrilled with the invitation out of the blue from Bakersfield, and it had been the impetus she had needed to take up her professional life again, revive, expand. These were gestures towards autonomy, surely, even if she hadn't thought of them that way. In these, her middle years, as people called the late 50s, early 60s, she was too old to cry about leaving. Armand Lou was her second husband. She had been through marital difficulties before. Why did she feel so near a well of sobs as she neared the station? There are times you feel you've made a mess of your life. That was the sum of it. The harder to bear when you think of yourself as a basically competent person, even an accomplished one, two failed marriages, and so late in the day, argued the opposite, incompetence. But she told herself, marriage does not define your life.
Oh, I love that. I love that. That's so wonderful. And I love that this opening scene where the past thrusts itself onto her and she's finding meaning in that. Is this sort of where you wanted to start this new arc for this woman of a certain age, as you speak of? It's such a interesting time for a woman where she's trying to redefine herself separate from this marriage. And I just thought that was just a perfect start to it. Everything sort of erupting again, the past coming back. Is that the kind of thing you were thinking about when you started?
Well, yes, it is. The metaphorical significance, as I mentioned in the first line. Yeah, the past coming back and the startling, abrupt event that sets everything in motion. Naturally, you can imagine the book comes back to the graveyard and things related to it. But the beginning of the book and mentioning her age so right away was because the book, actually, I wanted to see if a woman of middle age, even late middle age, could be the heroine of a book. You know, mostly heroines are young women, and there's always the implicit interest in her eventual settlement, marriage, usually love affair, whatever. So for somebody for whom that was all past, ostensibly, was kind of a challenge that I was taking up. So.
Well, I love that you took on that challenge, especially because the conversation so often is about how women become invisible as they age. And here you've made a book where the spotlight is on her. And it's a really difficult age, actually, to be, to have to redefine yourself again at that age when people are not paying attention to you. You're no longer the cute young thing.
You're the invisible.
Yeah. And you have children who are now adults who maybe still need you, and you're trying to juggle that. They're, independent people, but they are still your children, and she's struggling with that. And I thought, what a challenge to take this on. And I really appreciated that you did that. So really love that. And this is also a story where in the beginning, not your first book, but early on, The Divorce, you have a woman going to France. And here is an American coming home too. So it's also that part of the arc, that.
Absolutely. There was a sort of arc in my work, which I thought of too, as kind of bookend.
Yes, perfect.
Yes. That Isabel in The Divorce is a young American woman going to Paris, and Lorna is a middle-aged woman coming back after 20 years in France. So I thought that was nicely symmetrical. Yeah.
It's very nicely symmetrical, and it also reflects sort of the arc in women's lives too, the sort of of things that happen. Did you find, how is it different having a character being young with, what she thinks is in front of her, going to a foreign country, versus a woman who already has a lot of things that have happened within her life, now returning home? What were the challenges in writing that character versus the first character?
Well, actually, it turns out not dissimilar, because Lorna finds that she has all these things in front of her. Her grown children have problems or issues to solve. A grandchild comes into it. Her first husband comes into it. So the past is always with us, I guess. And as long as we're alive, the future lies ahead. And so it really was kind of the same. The character dealing with some situation that is lying before her.
So there's always a future.
There's always a future. Yeah, in this case, there's more memories. Isabel in The Divorce, of course, didn't have any memories of France or of many love affairs or husbands or any of the things that Lorna can look back on. But Lorna's a forward-looking person anyway, not somebody who dwells in the past. And that is a different character than somebody. There are books which very movingly characterize someone going over their lives, you know, sort of Krapp's Last Tape, or, you know, there's a lot of that in Beckett, or we can think of a lot of books where people look back, but Lorna doesn't really look back, except where she has to deal with some consequence of something that happened in the past.
Right. But she does have expectations as to what San Francisco's like, and those are challenged by when she comes home. Is this based on your own experience, as you actually do live part-time in Paris and in San Francisco? So
yes.
You have many times come home and maybe San Francisco isn't exactly what you imagined it to be when you're homesick for it. It's your memory of your home is different than the reality of it.
Well, that's right. And then the reality in San Francisco changes too. And this year in particular, with all the restrictions of COVID, there's this kind of Stalinist atmosphere that's very daunting, really. And all the situations with restaurants. And I don't know, I can't tell you in the 3 days I've been back, how many times I've encountered some problem related to San Francisco's dealing with COVID.
Oh, interesting.
I think maybe everyone else slid into it more gracefully or something. And Paris is less hung up about it, I think, even though it has the same rate. They're equally wearing masks. It's not masks that one objects to, but the general. Like I was having a mammogram yesterday. I'm doing all my doctor's appointments, dentist. And you couldn't go into the lobby of Mount Zion because before people came up and did, practically took your temperature, and you had to show them. It was just so much more complicated and all done in a kind of mean way, as though we know you're an infected person who's trying to get in here. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I hope it's not that way in Marin. But
I think it's, I don't know. I can't speak to everybody, but I think everybody's very worn out at this point, and
maybe
it's very hard for the medical personnel, I imagine, have maybe reached their limit.
Maybe they have. Maybe they're just completely fed up.
I think they're exhausted.
Yeah.
But it brings up something. Maybe there's things that we could learn from the French. Do you find that when living there and writing about them?
I asked myself, in dealing with COVID, you mean? There's
just
lots
in
of
general, just in life.
Well, in general, we can learn a lot, but. And that was what interested me in some of my earlier books, which were set in France. And I was, always interested in the contrast. San Francisco is really not a good example of a place to compare to France, because in many ways it's quite
interesting.
French. Yeah, I mean, it has the attitude and interest in food. It's foodie the way France is. Mm-hmm. And the same with cultural events, although France has lots more of them. France doesn't quite have the traffic problems that San Francisco does, but San Francisco has hills, so it can't be quite so graceful about bicycles. Mm-hmm. Paris now has lots of bicycle lanes. And maybe in general, France is more relaxed, more a little more joie de vivre, let's say. It does. It doesn't have some of the American problems, political problems, for example, that we have. So,
and it's interesting. The book actually takes place in 2008. Speaking of political problems, you avoided the last few years.
I did. I thought it was too much. I couldn't really have dealt with Trump I mean, that in about 20 years, people will start writing Trump books that, deal with the transformation of the national mood. But I thought that was beyond me, in fact. So it was, and also San Francisco is not a place that was greatly transformed by Trump.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't. I gather there wasn't much Trumpism around here. I would be surprised if there were.
We're a bit of a bubble. It's true.
Yeah. So the bubble, in a way, made it. Yeah. If I had placed it now, it would have seemed unreal because it wasn't dealing with the bigger Trump situation. Yeah.
But 2008 was a financially precarious year.
That was the crash. That's right. Yeah. And that affects Lorna in her.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I was interested in all that too, the economics of it. My late friend, Alison Lurie, who's a great friend who died recently, she was a little disapproving of this book. She said it's all about money. And I think she'd reached a more spiritual point in her life. And but it is all about money in a way. I mean, everybody has to deal with some economic issue, and just like in real life, because everyone does. And the crash epitomized that.
And it's an incredible stressor in people's lives.
Incredible.
And how people react to stress is what makes great drama and literature. And so no surprise that you use that in your books. And this isn't the first book where money has been an issue.
I think it's usually an issue in people's life. If you think of all of Anthony Trollope, it's an issue in almost every one of his works that I can think of.
Yeah.
Love thrown in, of course.
Yeah.
Or some other kind of mystery or plot gimmick. But Dickens.
Yes.
I think the novel in general deals with economic reality, let's say.
True. And now, correct me if I'm wrong, but you have a PhD in Victorian literature. Is that correct?
Yes, I do. Yeah. I taught at Davis. I taught at Davis for years.
Oh, wow. So does focusing on because Victorian literature was the first to really talk about realities of daily life and these kinds of stressors, correct? Am I? Yeah. I'm not as. Yeah.
Well, you could really say that the novel began with the early Victorians. There wasn't much in the way of the novel before the late 18th century, but Jane Austen is all about finances. All those girls have to get married because there's no other way of supporting themselves. Or if you think of Jane Eyre having to be a governess, it's a perennial theme in the English novel anyway. I can't really speak for in Balzac, in the French novel too. It's all, maybe that's the novel's great subject. Although my friend Bob Gottlieb says that adultery is the great subject of the novel.
And you have that too. So.
You have to throw in a bit of adultery. So, yeah.
What is the difference? Do you read a lot of French novelists?
I don't. I'm sort of lazy. I read so badly and slowly in French. But I also have this really embarrassing to confess belief that French novels aren't very good. I mean, there are some of them. Some are wonderful, but not that many. And I've read those. And so just the everyday novels, I look at them and I'm always disappointed. I don't know what it is.
I wonder, are the themes different in the French novels?
The themes are different. Yeah, the themes are more, a lot of them are sort of moi, or couple, the couple. They're very kind of subjective, and that's part of it. They're not dealing, but there are some French novelists well back that are observers of society. Mm-hmm. But I don't know, there's something kind of solipsistic about them, I think.
I think I read somewhere where you talked about the difference between like the French being very private and the Americans being very public in terms of how they express themselves with things. And maybe in some ways that informs your characters, you know, that Americans, because we live out loud in our way, we're easier to write about in some ways because of that versus keeping our private stuff private.
Well, yeah, that's probably right. Yeah, absolutely. But then if they turn to the novel, they make their private stuff public to a rather boring extent. Go into the subjective states of mind. So I don't know. It's just a different way of conceiving of the novel, or different routes for the novel. Something just makes them a little different.
Yeah. How was it writing about America after living in France for so long?
Well, I was looking forward to doing that and coming back and having lots of fresh and new impressions. And so I enjoyed doing that. I'm still finding things that I left out of the book. I found one yesterday. I went to the De Young, and I was very fascinated by the labels next to paintings, and all of the labels emphasized PC issues. Like, I don't know, here's a picture of an Indian in a forest, and the label will say this Native American escaping being enslaved by imperialist white masters. I don't know who wrote these things, but they were so kind of almost comically politically correct in their allusions to things like race and things that we all know. We know about the American Indian and how badly he was treated by, but here are all these little very preachy labels. And I thought, well, that's America.
Do you also think that maybe that's generational? Just how we perceive of these things, and put that, because you have a lot of generational things in your writing as well. You know, Lorna has her children and her grandchildren.
Yeah.
I know even with my own kids, things that I notice they don't, or things that they notice I don't. Like we just see the world differently already.
Maybe so, but these things, maybe these things were addressed to younger people to make sure that they knew that there had been slavery in America, or that the Indians were mistreated, something like that, or that you had to say Native American and not Indian anymore, or whatever. These were probably generational PC issues that have changed since my children were in school, let us say, let alone when I was in school.
Now you have quite a large blended family, correct?
Yes.
Right? Did you look at your own family relationships when you think about the mother-child relationships that Lorna has here?
Very much so. Yeah. I have 2 daughters and a stepdaughter, and then 2 step-granddaughters. Everybody else is male in my family, but they certainly had to inform my conception of girls of their age. Yeah. And like Gilda is the grandchild, actually the grandchild of Lorna's first husband, and the child of Lorna's first husband, but of a grandchild age. And now I've lost, what I was going to say about Lorna, about Gilda, except that I had to look at people of her age but sort of vicariously, because they weren't my children, they were my grandchildren.
Right.
Yeah.
Do your children read your work? And
some of them do, and some of them don't. They do now. They didn't when I first started writing. I think they found it just horribly embarrassing, especially if there was sex in it. They just, yeah, so, they early on they would say, "I'm not going to read it, Mom," or "I'm sorry, Mom," but now I think a few have snuck a peek and actually read them.
And you said that Allison, your friend Allison, was one of your first readers. Do you have a lot of writers and believe that there's a community of writers that you still see regularly when you're in Paris? Is that correct?
Well, in Paris, yes. We have a kind of writer's lunch, for a novelist lunch, to even narrow it further. And it began with people who were living in Paris, Jake Lamar, me, Mavis Gallant, and Ward Just. And Ward Just and Mavis are now dead. And but it kind of struggles along with visiting novelists. And there are always some visiting novelists. And for instance, Amy comes when she's in Paris.
Wonderful. Yeah.
So yeah, and that's because we actually miss having English-speaking colleagues and a kind of little literary circle that we would automatically have in New York or San Francisco. So.
And you were, as a professor, I imagine you've sort of lived a life surrounded by writers. And maybe you missed that, but I heard you speak about writing programs in America. And I thought it was fascinating, where you talked about, the speech you were giving was about how these commonly repeated axioms, the show, don't tell, write what you know, find your voice, how we all repeat these things over and over again.
Yeah.
And are we making ourselves sound the same? Do we even believe that these things are true across the board? And is this a uniquely American way to approach writing?
Well, I suppose it's an attempt to define what, common things that all writers should do, reduced to axioms. But I don't believe them entirely. I sort of see where they came from, but where they were promulgated so vigorously by writing programs. Mm-hmm. And I've now forgotten the name of this very fascinating book called The Writing Program in America. That's, it has a more interesting title than that, written by a professor at Stanford, who examines the whole phenomenon and finds rather uniquely American the phenomenon of the writer's program. Mm-hmm. And one of the very most notable, or the oldest and most revered, is the writing program at Iowa. Yeah. And at Iowa, there was a particular teacher, I'm blanking on his name, you would recognize it. Maybe you will remember it. It'll come to me. Who was the big exponent of these rules. And, what is his name? My God. Someone will know. I hope if there's someone watching. Because I would have students then at Davis, where I taught creative writing, who would say, but no, would refuse my criticism or my comments by saying, Mr. Doesn't agree with that, or he told me that this would be the way I should do it, or whatever. A very authoritarian and evidently attractive figure at Iowa. Who was that? Anyway, there are these gurus out there, and they establish these rules, and you have to think around them or use them when you need them, but not. I mean, obviously, write about what you know is a good idea, and almost every great work is based on something that the writer knows. I mean, War and Peace, but there are works of the imagination,
right?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, think of, I don't know, J.K. Rowling. Everything she knows is in that book, but she added. I don't think it argues against working with your imagination, but at some level, she knows the world of Harry Potter.
That's true.
And so,
Well, I guess it goes to show that you should always examine any advice that is given to you and see when it applies.
Yeah. Yes.
Right. So do you have a specific routine for writing that you've set up?
I try to write in the mornings, like most writers. And because I've always had a lot of kids and people around, I've had to also compartmentalize a lot and learn to slip away and write when it's possible. Now, now that I don't have any children at home, or now my late husband, not a husband at all, I find that I scribble at intervals during the day and whenever I feel like it.
Oh, that's nice. I heard somewhere that you learned from your time working on The Shining, because you were the screenwriter for The Shining, right?
Yeah.
From Kubrick, how to outline a scene, and that you still use those techniques today for outlining your scenes in your book.
That is correct. Well, I have two proponents of outlines. And Kubrick was a great believer in outlining the scenario.
Okay.
And making an outline for a screenplay and then breaking it down into scenes. And there should be 125 scenes. And he had all these rules and good ideas, which I found very structuring and very, very fascinating or very reassuring to have, and very, very useful when applied to the novel. Then Alice Adams, I don't know if you remember Alice, a very close friend. And when she was at Radcliffe during her college age, she took a writing class, and there the professor said, a short story is always A, B, D, C, E.
Oh.
And so I found that I wrote a whole novel by writing A, B, D, C, and then leaving out the E for each chapter. And then finally, the final chapter would have the E. Those stand for action, to get people's attention. The graveyard slipping out there. Background, Lorna, leaving her husband. D, development.
Okay.
C, conclusion, ending. Or in the case of a chapter, no ending.
So you basically structured every chapter as if it was a short story, but without the ending.
Without the ending, yeah. Yes. And I did that for, I forget which of my novels. I abandoned it a little bit and wasn't quite so rigorous with this, with Lorna, but I did it with, I think I did it with Lulu. Anyway, I've done it with whole novels, and it actually works, and it gives you a kind of wonderful thing to hang on to, even if you have to deviate a little.
That makes so much sense now from reading your novels, because every chapter is like that. It's just the perfect little short story that you have. And I feel there's one other time I felt that, and that's when I read Anthony Doerr's work, and he's famous for being an incredible short story writer. And I always felt like I could take out any one of his chapters and it would have been a beautiful little short story.
That's interesting. Yeah. And he teaches the short story, I think.
I think so.
I never write short stories. I have written two, maybe in my life, but I in effect use that structure for the chapters.
I love that. And I think I heard you say once before that you actually also write outlines for other people's work, that you've done it for Emma. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, that is correct. I did it for Emma. I must have talked about that somewhere that you heard, because I don't think I've ever written anything about that. But yes, I did Emma, and I think maybe Pride and Prejudice too.
Wow.
And The Good Soldier.
Oh.
And in terms of these elements, action, background, development, conclusion, ending, and I mean that gave me a way of saying Emma comes in. That's A. We learn that she's the neighbor of Mr. Knightley. That's B, background, etc. So it's a way of looking at other novels. I mean, it makes me sound like a math teacher or something.
No, I love it.
But it's, I don't know, it's what I do anyway. Yeah.
Well, I love, because it gives you that kind of, not only do you enjoy the book as it is, but then you go back and really look at the structure of it and deconstruct it. And then when you're working with your own, you can sort of figure out how you would construct something.
Yeah, exactly. And that it benefited me so much to look at Jane Austen or Ford Madox Ford and see how, see the structure of their work. And I'm not sure, Ford Madox Ford and Conrad wrote some rules for writing, but I don't know if they ever addressed the subject of the outline. But I'll have to look and see.
Is writing about the Bay Area different than writing about France?
Well, yeah, a little bit, yeah. Because it's just more familiar. I know the street. Well, now France is almost more familiar than San Francisco. So coming back to San Francisco is the exotic experience. But when I first went to France, I noticed everything in this, way you have when you're in a new place. And that is very exciting for writing about, because you get everything.
Yeah.
And then it kind of wears off and it's your normal place. Mm-hmm. And then it's not quite so fresh. So coming back to San Francisco is fresh for a minute, but I have to say now it's, even in 3 days, it's reasserted its familiarity with some new unpleasant wrinkles that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's been a little bit tough in San Francisco. Yeah. And the change in terms of what Silicon Valley, which you touch on, the changes, the economic changes in this city have been pretty dramatic.
I just noticed that in the restaurant scene, because we've tried to go out to restaurants a couple of times in my 3 days. And, just prices are staggering in San Francisco now. I think more expensive than Paris.
Really? Oh, wow.
I would say so, yeah. But maybe it's, I don't know how fully I'm making the translation from dollar to euro and back. Mm-hmm. So maybe they're the same, but they seem expensive. It seems expensive to me here.
It seems expensive to me here too. So
yeah, and it was like, I don't know, this is not the real example, but it was as though I came into the airport, looked for one of those carts that you used to pay $3 for, and now it's $25. I mean, no, it wasn't $25, but it was a lot. It was more,
right?
And in a kind of shocking way, like, what? $7 for that stupid cart? Yeah.
It's not an easy city, which I think always surprises people. It's not an easy city to get around. It's not an easy city to, I find going to New York even easier because subway is so much easier. Just getting around is easier there.
Oh, I've been complaining about this on the phone all morning, so maybe I've already said to you, recounted my experience trying to get back from Divisadero and Sutter yesterday because my grandson has my car, and because he needs it for his job, and I thought, oh well, I'll just Uber around. So a friend dropped me at this place. When I was done, there were no Ubers. I had a message on my phone. There are no Ubers, cars available. There was no bus. The bus line down Sutter has been stopped for some reason. I think there might have been a possible bus on Divisadero. Anyway, no taxis.
Oh, wow.
And so I thought, I don't know how I'm getting home. It's actually a little too far to walk. And then to redeem the city, a nice Asian woman came up and said, "May I help you?" And I said, and she said, "Call 333-3333, which turns out to be yellow cab. So I called a yellow cab, and it came and took me back. So wow. It all worked out. But for a while, for 10 minutes or something, it seemed like there were actually no options for getting public transportation of any kind.
It does feel like a scene from one of your books, actually, that would happen.
It will be.
On the next book, I expect to see that one.
Yes.
Stranded in the city.
I'm
going to look. I know there's questions, so I'm just going to. Cheryl is asking, how did you come to have the character Gilda get married? I thought that was peculiar given the current mores of unmarried women having babies. Ooh, that might give away something there.
That might. Yeah. Gilda or Gilda, I never did decide how to pronounce it. I thought of it as Gilda because I just knew someone called Gilda. But Gilda, I think the old Rita Hayworth name was Gilda.
Right.
So anyway, yeah. She, it's just convention in her, the point being that she comes from this more conventional WASPy family and believed in marriage, but she herself didn't. Who knows what will happen?
Who do you read? This is always something that all of our customers are curious with all the writers that come and speak to us. Who do you enjoy reading?
Well, I'm now kind of in an Anthony Powell phase, and some of those English writers, Hartley, some of those English writers of the 40s, and I enjoy going back to. I always read old novels from like Anthony Trollope, and novels. I'm getting to the point where I don't read a novel unless I know I'm going to like it. So that means that I'm going to read novels that I've read already.
There's something wonderful about that, though, isn't there? Revisiting
yes,
what you've read before.
It is wonderful. But the truth to tell, I don't read as many novels as I used to. I read other things. History, works about history. I'm writing something about an 18th century sea captain that kind of related to my book about Mrs. Meredith, which is a whole nother story.
So you're nonfiction. You're working on nonfiction.
So it's a nonfiction work about anti-slavery in the around 1800.
Oh, wow.
In the British Navy and in America. And so I'm learning a lot by the reading, which is very fascinating. And I don't know how quite. I've written a little about it, but it started with the idea that it will involve how much we are all affected by the fact of slavery in America. I grew up in Illinois, land of Lincoln. My great-grandparents knew Lincoln. There's this pervasive Yankees-ness about that part of the country. And then there's the whole South with its separate tradition. And I had this curious experience of, I ordered a book that I remember from childhood called Diddy Dumps and Tot. And it was a children's book. I loved it when I was a child. So I ordered it for my own children. I go to the bookstore, and the woman says, well, I ordered it. And it came in, and I looked at it. And I don't think that you want to read this book to your children. In fact, I'll sell it to you, but don't read it to them. And so I looked at it, and it was really quite horrifying. I can't imagine a period in which it didn't shock. It was about pickaninnies. It takes place on a plantation. The pickaninnies are happy. The white and black children get along. It's a very Edenic view of a plantation. And I loved that. I loved the way everyone got presents at Christmas and they all had barbecue. The things that you would love reading about as a child without investigating or being conscious of the basic underlying assumption about slavery. This was obviously a 19th century book, probably written around 1880, after the Civil War. But it was nostalgia, and so somehow Diddy Dumps and Tot is coming into my book. And things like that, just elements of,
How even you didn't even remember the parts that were objectionable to the story. Just remember.
Right, they weren't objectionable as far as to a child, what they seemed like was a happy situation. Yeah, I mean,
but don't even realize.
Yeah, exactly. So there's lots of elements like that in our life in America now, which I'm just thinking about as a quilt, which will stitch together some of these recollections or observations, some reading.
Wow.
And
quite an undertaking.
Well, it's quite far afield for anything I've done before too, so I don't know how far it will get or whether it'll work.
Well, I'm sure interesting for also your grandkids to read. I mean, to see this was something that you read when you were little. You had a different memory of it. When you see it now, and then talking about America as a whole and the kind of racist things that we did not acknowledge for so long, that we allowed to continue with this sort of fond memory and only, when looking back on it, really realize what was going on. And now contending with that and leaning into our uncomfortableness with all of that. I think really
the preachy labels on the pictures at the De Young.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So interesting that is your new project. Do you have another fiction book that's on the horizon as well, or?
Well, I'm hoping that one will kind of come to mind. But in the meantime, doing the research and reading up this other topic has been interesting. Just to say nothing of the Battle of New Orleans and that whole period before the Civil War, which is interesting.
Yeah.
So, we'll see.
I have a question for you that's actually from my 13-year-old daughter, and I think it's a great question, so I'm definitely going to ask it, which is, when you're writing, is there a reader that you have in mind, somebody that you want to read your books?
Yes, I think there's an implicit ideal reader, and then sometimes that person takes form. I used to have actual first readers. Allison was one, and my husband John was the other. And Alice Adams too would read early things. And now I have I'm a little leery of imposing first drafts on people.
I can't imagine anybody would be upset about that.
Well, it's always hard to put things out,
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yes, I think there has to be an ideal reader.
Wow. That's really interesting. Well, Diane, thank you so much. This has been absolutely fascinating. We love your writing. We love this new book, Lorna Mott Comes Home. And I can't tell you, I think after talking to you, I want to reread this. We were just talking about rereading books you enjoyed and talking about outlining books that you enjoyed. I really think that's my new project. I'm going to reread and outline your book and see what you did, because I'm fascinated by that whole idea. And I love your how you approach it, your writing. So this is very exciting for me.
Thank you.
Thank you for everything. That was wonderful. And thank you for everybody that tuned in today for this incredible conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And I also want to thank Zach, who is behind the scenes and making us look like we know what we're doing in front of the camera, running everything. And thank you for everybody that turned up today. I hope that you will all enjoy this book as much as I did, and have a wonderful rest of your week, and look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thank you, Luisa.
You're welcome. Bye.
Bye.